I met the string beans at the Hopkins Farmers Market back on Saturday, September 18th. Farmers markets are community events. Heck, I met a whole bunch of fine folks that Saturday. And I spotted Dave Spohr from Eden Prairie. 2 decades ago, we helped save Birch Island Woods in Eden Prairie from the developers and the so-called progress. Back then, without community newspapers, our voices would not have been heard. And today, folks wouldn't know much about this here farmers market, this candidate, or the string beans. But the local weeklies are dying out. The pandemic, the hedge fund pirates, and social media are the culprits. The engines of democracy are being shut down.
This is Democratic Visions with producer Jeff Strate. In late September, Jeff talked about local journalism with Brad Canham and Nick Matthews at BCAT, Bloomington's Access Studio. Matthews edited newspapers in Houston and Virginia. He's finishing journalism studies for a doctorate at the University of Minnesota.
That's fine.
Brad Canham was a reporter in Marshall, Minnesota and Wisconsin. He's the founding editor of the Eden Prairie Local News. He recently returned to his doctoral studies at St. Thomas University.
Well, I'm pleased to be here with Nick Matthews, who's coming to us from Virginia via Skype or YouTube or one of those things, I forget it was, and Brad Canham, the founding editor of the Eden Prairie Local News. Now, gentlemen, this is a conversation, not an interview. I have one question. What is a news desert? Nick?
So there are textbook definitions. There are definitions that have come from a group of scholars at the University of North Carolina in particular. They define it as areas of the country where residents have very limited access to the sort of credible and comprehensive news and information that feeds democracy. And a lot of scholars have considered they do it by countywide, but it is very much looking at areas that do not have newspapers in particular. So a local newspaper within an area, daily or weekly. Now in the United States, there are roughly 225 news deserts, defined as is, that do not have a daily or weekly newspaper or any other credible news organization.
Nick, could you repeat that number for people? That's a large number.
225 counties.
Without a newspaper.
Without a newspaper, daily or weekly.
Wow.
Now, there remain about 5,500 non-daily newspapers in the country, so it's still a substantial number. Many of those are serving rural communities, and many of them are the only publication that is serving communities as well. And so there remains a hefty bulk of them. But since 2004, roughly about 2,000 non-dailies have shut down. And since 2004, the United States has lost roughly a quarter of its newspapers.
How does that affect the life of people in the community that's lost its newspaper? Brad, you were founding editor of the Eden Prairie Local News.
Well, so I can speak to the news desert effect and the reason why EPLN was founded.
EPLN is Eden Prairie Local News,
Eden
right?
Prairie Local News.
Yeah, okay.
So, and I don't think this story is unique. I think it's kind of a template for how news deserts have been occurring in the U.S. So in February 5th of 2020, Alden Global Capital, a hedge fund out of New York, purchased 11 papers, weekly papers in Minnesota. The local Eden Prairie News, the 46-year-old weekly in Eden Prairie, was one of those papers. 85 days later, Eden Prairie News paper was shuttered by Alden Global Capital Group, leaving us with another newspaper which covers on a weekly basis several other southwestern communities, but I think fair estimation doesn't comprehensively cover what one would expect for a city like Eden Prairie, which has 65,000 people in it.
Now, I live in Eden Prairie, and I contribute to the Eden Prairie Local News, but you and a fellow named Mark Weber got the thing going, and obviously you saw something happening to our community.
Well, if you remember the period of early 2020, George Floyd was murdered on May 25th of 2020 on 38th Street and Chicago in Minneapolis. Shortly, right around June 4th, I sent a editorial talking about this is a moment regarding the conscience of the country to the other newspaper in Eden Prairie. And it was they asked me to whittle it down to effectively chop it to a third of its length. And I just said, well, it's sanitized to a point that it's meaningless at that measure. And there was no coverage of what were some protests happening in Eden Prairie. I found that intolerable. So a historic moment in the midst of a racial reckoning in the community, COVID was beginning to take off. There were concerns about both local and national politics and elections that were going to take place in the next several months, and we had no local newspaper. That was an affront to someone with a impulse involving a strengthened democracy. So I took it very personally, and so did other people in the community.
And you've been publishing, or we've been publishing for a little over a year right now, correct?
Right. So we published our first piece on September 16th, I believe, of 2020. We have now hit close to 100,000 page views every 30 days.
That's good.
Since that early article.
In his studies for his doctoral, Nick has been looking at rural communities in Virginia, central Virginia. What has been the effect on these more rural communities?
When there is no news organization, you're missing a critical link in many ways between governmental officials and citizens. And so in Caroline County, which is the county you alluded to, they lost a weekly newspaper after 99 years of service to the county. And so one of the residents there told me that, she wanted to go to as many county government meetings as she could, but she's not getting paid. She just wanted to go. And you can't go every week. Sometimes you're going to miss something. So one of the stories that really struck out to me is that she told me that she went to a meeting one week, hadn't gone the previous couple weeks beforehand, so she wasn't up to speed necessarily with the discussion that was going on in the government meeting. And it made her really realize that, okay, I don't know what's not going on. What am I missing? I honestly don't know what I don't know. And that was the role of the county newspaper, was to provide that information and provide that link and understanding for what's actually going on out in the county. And without a county newspaper, without any news organization themselves, the residents frankly have to act as reporters themselves. So they have to go to government websites, they have to go to different social media accounts, and often that is with tremendously frustrating results. I mean, it is, as former reporters would tell you, it's not easy, and they're getting paid. These people and the residents are not doing it. They're doing it because they care about it. So one of the people really struck a line out that said, life is harder in Caroline County without the Caroline Progress.
And Nick, there's a lot of information that people can get their hands on, right? There's a quote by Annie Proulx. She's a National Book Award winner, and if I paraphrase it, there's a garbage-laden tsunami of raw data available to people. But there's a difference between data and knowledge and news. And part of the role, I believe, of a local news organization is to sift through all this data, all this information, and turn it into knowledge for the audience that is factual, relevant, fair, that serves
accessible,
that serves a greater good. that informs people. It's knowledge. I mean, that is part of the role of what EPLN took on again, rather than, otherwise people are basing their decisions on opinions, and their behavior is based on opinions and just kind of guessing.
And I think you're
an
absolutely
undemocratic approach.
You're onto something in that there is I think you use the word tsunami. I mean, there's just this gauntlet of information that is available if you want to go through it, if you want to verify it as well. And so because you just don't know. And so a lot of folks in Caroline County had told me that they go to a Facebook group, right? Just a local county Facebook group where there are 1,000 different people within the county posting information back and forth. The people I talk to do not trust that group on Facebook for the validity of the information. Important point here. They do not trust content that is provided and written by their neighbors. However, when it came in a medium that was printed and delivered to them on a weekly basis or on the digital platforms, printed by their neighbors who lived in the county and who reported for the county, they believed it. And so it was very much that medium and that trusted news organization that made the difference.
Well, I want to follow up kind of maybe on a little academic note based on some academic work by Duguid and Brown, The Social Life of Information. Make that same note that a paper as an artifact still has a resonance that digital media, it's just different. And so Eden Prairie Local News, although initially we were all online, now we are moving, and we put out one print edition, and we're going to a quarterly basis, and we're going to kind of build from there, because communities are formed around documents, and they're documents that you want to be able to hold in your hand because they have some permanence to it. So there's some community connecting happening relative to, creating a new news organization that I held to, in my role, and said we're going to do print. I didn't want to give up on print.
Yeah.
Well, and you're actually teeing up my most recent publication, so I greatly appreciate that. I actually wrote a piece that articulated this connection that you're talking about.
Great.
And I identified it conceptually as print in print, as it was this actual connection between a newspaper, the physical printed product, and the reader's self, what they felt. And so it was this connection between nostalgia, touch, as you mentioned, and actual ownership. This idea that people feel that it is my paper. You've heard that phrase before, people talk about it. There's a connection there. That the content in a digital platform, in many ways, is often identical, if not very close to identical, as the same content in a printed product. But there is something special to a lot of people about holding that printed newspaper when they're reading it.
Agreed.
There was one audience member in Caroline County who lamented the fact that his hands were clean. They're not dirty. He wanted to get his hands dirty.
Right.
That showed the relationship that he had with that newspaper.
Sure. Well, we handed out our first edition of the Eden Prairie Local News during Eden Prairie's 4th of July celebration at Round Lake Park. And it was printed on really cheap newsprint with cheap ink. But it really felt good.
Right.
As we handed them out. I think we handed well over 1,000 out that day, maybe more. I need to feel uncomfortable reading even a magazine or a newspaper. And if I'm in an airplane, I like to irritate my neighbors with a big broadsheet.
There you go.
Since you were at the Houston Chronicle, things have changed an awful lot. You were a senior editor there, correct?
Yes, I was the sports editor of the Houston Chronicle for 4 years.
4 years.
And after that, I was actually a regional editor-in-chief, which brought me to Charlottesville, Virginia initially.
Okay.
I was a regional editor based here in Charlottesville for Berkshire Hathaway. So I oversaw the news operation for 3 daily newspapers and 3 weekly newspapers. And it was really seeing the weekly leaders up close and seeing the work and the connection that they have with their communities that inspired the research line that I've gone down. I don't know what's not changed. I mean, it is absolutely incredible. I mean, the volume of people, like, even before Houston. So and this would have been in 2008, 2009. I was the sports editor of the Daily Press in Newport News, Virginia. I went through 4 rounds of layoffs in 4 years, where I was a supervisor, had to make those very difficult decisions that no one should have to make. Now, that was in 2008, and we haven't gotten better since then. You know, we're losing personnel left and right. And to what you guys were talking earlier about Alden and other hedge funds, I mean, their MO is to cut and burn. And that's what they're doing to news organizations. And if they can't cut the personnel to the point where the revenue share go up enough, they're just going to cut the product, as you guys have seen up close and personal. In some places, the definition of news is very squishy. So when you're looking at a county newspaper, a weekly newspaper, I will argue in some ways that advertising, or at least calendar invites or calendar schedules of events in town, that can be news. To a lot of people, those are news. If you see an ad about a fish fry at a local church, that's news to you, and you're going to go.
And what about you and Marshall? Things have changed from your days there.
Well, things have changed and things haven't changed. It was interesting. So I was in Marshall, Minnesota as a daily news reporter for a couple of years. This would have been in the early 90s. And I covered hard news, politics, murder, mayhem, etc. And one of the categories of news that was happening at that point in Marshall, Minnesota was the influx of immigrants from Mexico and other Latin American countries and the tensions with the local community. And that gave rise to one of the largest stories that I did down there, which was effectively tracked down an individual who was the head of a neo-Nazi group, and that went on the AP and went nationwide. And that young man then went on to be the head of the National Socialist movement in America, the largest neo-Nazi organization in the country, for the next 25, 30 years. I followed his then career in that role. And so in some ways, things haven't changed. That still resonated with me for many years.
In Caroline County, as we had talked about, it was after the 99-year-old weekly newspaper shuttered, there was a gentleman in the county who took it upon himself to start a weekly product, or he started a product. And he was covering news and events and sports, and he did everything. I mean, really, really cares about the community. Did it as a digital product, did it on social media, and even did a newsletter. But the residents themselves actually called him out on the fact that there was no printed newspapers we were talking about earlier.
And how's the Eden Prairie News going? I know you're retired from editing right now, but still contributing. Yeah. Is our local newspaper going to make it?
Well, the other, Jeff, the other hat that I wear is I work in startups, right? So that's where the majority of my career's been in the past 2 decades.
Startup companies.
Startup companies.
Not just newspapers.
Not
right?
just newspapers,
Yeah, okay.
but entrepreneurial endeavors in which there's, the putting in place structures, processes, teams, a mission that it's key to have a mission. And based on that, I believe Eden Prairie Local News is more than just the numbers, which have been fantastic, frankly. We've scaled from 0 to 100,000 page views a month in about a year. And that, I think, has surprised everybody. But the mission at the core of Eden Prairie Local News to inform the local citizens with factual content that they can use to make decisions, and we call it in service to the common good of the community. In large measure, Nick, that's speaking to kind of a democratic ethos. Like, we're making decisions based on facts, based on understanding the truth of what's happening at the school board, the truth of what's happening at the city council meetings and in various areas around, this lovely stretch of community called Eden Prairie. It's not based on opinions. It's not based on abstract ideas about what's right or wrong. It's based on the fact that, well, that street flooded. That's why all those cars are going that way, not because, some made up reason.
We as academics, as practitioners, care a lot about the democratic link between news organizations and between the government, news organizations, and community members. That is not the only thing community members care about. They care about Burger King. They care a lot about Burger King.
Yeah.
They care a lot about the events that are going on, the sports that are going on, the arts festivals that are going on. So it's the things beyond just democratic news that matter to news consumers. And that gets lost in a lot of this. And so let me give one quick anecdote from Caroline County, is that I asked all the people that I talked to, what was the one thing that they missed the most from the Caroline Progress since it shuttered? It wasn't new, it wasn't civic engagement news, it wasn't anything along those lines, it wasn't hard news. They missed the half-page content every week on the inside of the paper that it was a calendar of events of what was going on. Remember, in these rural areas, you might be a mile away from your closest neighbors. These events that are going on in town bring people together. They actually form a community. One quick anecdote from research I'm doing here in Virginia right now, it was from a owner, publisher, and editor of a weekly newspaper. And so she had told me in April of 2020, now this was the height of the coronavirus when newspapers are being decimated, even more so than before, that she wrote an editorial to her audience. This is a rural county out in western part of Virginia. She wrote to her audience that said, we're dying. We have roughly 5 weeks of funds to be able to continue to keep this newspaper going. Otherwise, we're going to be forced to shutter it. Very much a transparent call for help from her community members. The community rescued the news organization. Subscribers extended their subscription. People who weren't subscribers subscribed. Businesses purchased advertising. Donors came out in droves. So I talked to her about a month ago. So this is about 18 months or so after that, transparent call for help. She's on the verge of tears. So she had said, our readers saved us. I mean, so I am wondering, I guess my question off that story is, what can we learn from this? Is this an anomaly because this is a small weekly organization that's been around for 150 years and is connected that much with its audience? Or is there something that startups can learn from such things like this? What is it that larger news organizations can learn from this as well? Maybe I'm being naive, but I do not believe this is an anomaly. I believe news organizations can, over time, form this kind of bond with their readers. How do we build that bond, and is it possible? How can news organizations leverage this loyalty from their audience to potentially pay for more than just a station? Is there anything along these lines that we can learn to help fund news organizations? And it gets really difficult in rural areas of the country where, frankly, they're a little bit poorer. Broadband access is an issue, etc. Versus, I would say, like Austin, Texas. The Texas Tribune is a model that everybody wants to be. Not every city in this country is Austin, Texas. Believe me, I've been there. So, and Eden Prairie, for instance, I think is an area where this could work. There's a lot of there are a lot of potential resources there. Now, is it a model across the entire country? That's why I'm at a loss.
Speaking of the entrepreneurial space and the, mission of journalism, there's a very purposeful model at the basis of Eden Prairie Local News that's based on welding the endeavor to the community with the discussion that I would have with the team, by the way, who it's humbling how much volunteer work went into this. But you have to look at it from the context of, as you suggest, why? Why are they doing this? Why are thousands of hours being devoted to this? So what we talked about at Eden Prairie Local News were three things. When you're attempting to bond with a community or create a community, one of the ways that you can do that is by offering a gift. It's a fundamental social construct to offer a gift to a father-in-law, mother-in-law, something like this, as you're being introduced to into a social space. So Eden Prairie Local News was proffered as a gift to the community. Like, this is our gift to you. Because once a gift is accepted and once there's that sense of you care about us, then marketplaces can take place. So that's the entrepreneurial side to it. But it has to be a gift given in the right way, in the right spirit. So this is what we tried to do. We're trying to give a gift to the community during a time when, there's a pandemic, and it was a tough time. If you recall, the winter of 2020 was tough. And I'll just say there's two other pieces to that. There's gift giving. There is the ritual of a newspaper is part of the ritual of a community. So it's our job as a journalism endeavor to show up in some kind of ritual way. So at this point, we have the ritual of the quarterly newspaper. We have the ritual of the email that you receive that once there's actual news on that day. So we tried to find ways to make the rituals of what we are doing relative to providing knowledge to the community evident to the community. And the final one was telling the story, we call it the story of us, which is kind of like the story that couples tell each other about how they first met. Right? So how'd you meet your husband? How'd you meet your wife? How'd you meet your partner, et cetera, those kind of things. So the story of us in Eden Prairie, for example, would be there's a Southwest light rail transit line, huge infrastructure piece being built into Eden Prairie currently, Nick, and it's transforming the landscape of this lovely suburb. Well, that's an example of mass transit. So we've run stories about not only what that is happening currently, what that might mean for the community in the future. We had an article that described what that might have looked like, or what was being thought of in the 1970s, Jetsons type of things. And we had an article from the 1860s about an ox cart trail to the southern border of Eden Prairie. These are all examples of mass transit in Eden Prairie. This is the story of us. It's not on our masthead or anything, but as part of my job, the leadership role, that is what I was working with. The story of us, rituals, and this is a gift. And if it's given well, a marketplace, a value exchange, the community will reward us for the gifts that we're giving.
I love the idea of the story of us, very much so, in that one of the principles that I know my reporters and staff probably got tired of me saying all the time when I was an editor, but is the best way to tell the story of a community is through the people in a community. Tell the success stories, tell those who are overcoming obstacles, talk about the leaders in the community, talk about those who we need to hold responsible for the decisions, but tell the stories of everybody, of everyday citizens, because, everybody's got a great story to tell when given the opportunity.
Nick, well said. Thank you very much. Gentlemen, it's time to say goodbye. Let's have you back, maybe when Nick's back up in town with his academic advisors at the Hubbard School of Journalism and Mass Communication. Okay, thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Jeff.
Good.
Thanks for being with us. We'll see you next time, and please subscribe to your local newspaper, online or a print edition.
Democratic Visions is handcrafted by volunteers from Eden Prairie, Hopkins, Minnetonka, Edina, and Bloomington. Watch us on select cable systems and on our YouTube channel. This is Carol Sundstrom.